you believe there are beings quietly protecting us, even when we try to destroy them? Deep in the mountains of Utah lies a forgotten valley where time itself dares not tread. No phones, no signal, only the whisper of wind through the old forest. Locals say a monster lurks in the dark, but the truth is far stranger. It's not hunting them, it's saving them. And the real threat comes from humankind itself. This story comes from the recovered journal of Maeve Hollis, a former field nurse and the last witness to a sacred pact between man and the wild. In just under 10 minutes, you'll witness a face-to-face encounter with a creature never recorded in history, the secret of Kaelen's stream revealed for the first time, and a truth that will make you question how we treat the natural world. Lucas, a former sergeant battling PTSD, didn't believe in anything until the day that very creature saved his life, leaving behind evidence no one could deny. Skip this story, and you'll miss one of the most human tales ever hidden behind the legend of Bigfoot. Whispers of Kaelen Valley. Not every protector wears human skin. Before we begin, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your location in the comments. We'd love to send you a warm greeting from Kaelen Valley itself. Autumn came slow to Kaelen Valley, dragging a hush behind it like a wool blanket too heavy to lift. Tucked deep within the winter mountains of northeastern Utah, it was the kind of place where time didn't pass. It settled. Wind moved through the yellowed aspens like breath through the ribs of an old beast. No phone lines, no radio. Just the rustle of leaves, the soft gulp of the creek as it slipped over mossy rocks, and the distant sound of elk bugling somewhere beyond the ridge. The land didn't ask for attention. It only asked to be left alone. Maeve Hollis sat in a rocking chair on the porch that slouched slightly to one side, its boards softened by decades of snow and silence. She was 61, but the years sat in her shoulders more than her face. Her hands still moved with precision, the kind that comes from years spent stitching skin and tying tourniquets. But her eyes had gone quieter since the war, and quieter still after her son never came home. She wore her hair in a tight braid, silver running through like river thread, and her flannel sleeves were rolled back just far enough to reveal the faded medical ink tattooed on her wrist. Oh, Nagy. She didn't keep a clock. Didn't need one. Her days were marked by the sun dragging its feet across the sky and the weight of her chores. Her neighbors, if you could call folks spread across a 10-mile stretch of broken valley neighbors, knew her as the woman with willow bark in her jars and nettle tea in her cups, the one who taught kids how to read and treated their fevers when nobody else dared to drive the 30 miles down to Roosevelt. But most days, after the children had gone, after the chickens were fed and the firewood stacked, Maeve would sit there on the porch, facing east, her eyes fixed on the slope of the mountain where a government helicopter had gone down 15 years ago, and where no one, not even the rescue dogs, found anything worth burying. She didn't cry anymore. She just waited. For what? She wasn't sure. Maybe for something to return, or someone. That evening, with the air thinning into a pale blue hush and the aspens rattling like bones, Maeve stepped outside with her usual cup of mugwort tea and paused. Something sat at the edge of her porch, not placed haphazardly, not dropped by wind or deer. It was deliberate. A single deer antler, old and bleached, covered in moss so fine it looked like velvet, like it had been carried through wet forests and set there with purpose. A gift. She crouched slowly, her knees aching, and picked it up. Her fingers brushed the underside of the beam. That's when she saw it, pressed faintly into the moss like a memory someone meant her to find. A handprint. Not a child's, not even a man's. It was too wide, too long, the spacing too inhuman. A palm the size of a dinner plate, and fingers that bent in a way that suggested strength, not deformity. Something old, something enormous. Something alive. Maeve stood motionless. The wind shifted, curling around her ankles like a whisper. But she didn't feel fear. Not the kind that made your breath catch or your legs go weak. It was something else, like the eyes of a stranger on the back of your neck, but not hostile. Curious. Watching. Later that week, word came trickling down through the winding trails and hollowed CB radios. Ranchers had lost cattle. Again. Some found the fences bent inward, like something had stepped right over them. Some swore they saw shadows tall as elk, but walking on two legs. There were whispers about the Black Pine Trail, of something moving through the fog at night with a gait too smooth to be bear, too wide to be man. Talk of prints found in the mud near Whistler Creek, bare, five-toed, and deep enough to hold water. Maeve listened. She always listened. But she didn't add to the stories. Didn't mention the antler still resting on her mantle like a question no one else could answer. She noticed the way the forest paused sometimes, how the birds went quiet too suddenly, how the dogs whimpered and looked toward the tree line like they knew something waited there. She noticed the stillness that wrapped the valley at night, not like sleep, but like breath being held. And she remembered the way her son used to whisper when he was afraid, how he would say, "Don't look at the dark, Mom. Look through it. That's where the truth is." She wondered if he'd known something back then, that she was only now beginning to feel. The valley shifted slowly. Days shortened. The creek ran colder. Leaves curled in on themselves like fists. And somewhere high above the timberline, on a pass that marked the edge of the known and the forgotten, something else was moving. 2 nights later, Maeve was boiling elderberry over the stove when a sound cracked through the silence. An unfamiliar hum, low and mechanical, followed by the distant crunch of metal on stone. It wasn't thunder. It was too sudden. A rattle, then nothing. She stepped out, eyes scanning the dark horizon beyond the ridge. A faint orange glow flickered behind the Douglas Pass, then blinked out like a dying signal. By morning, the rumors had changed. A convoy, military no less, had tried to brave the narrow curve of the pass during the early snow. A dozen supply trucks headed for some backcountry installation. One had gone over. No survivors confirmed. Radio silence. They said a search party might come in a week, weather permitting. But some folks shook their heads, said the army wouldn't bother, that the place wasn't on any real map anymore. Maeve didn't believe in coincidences. Not here, not in Kaelen Valley. She stood on her porch that morning longer than usual, her fingers wrapped around the antler as if it might warm her. She didn't blink when she saw a raven pass low across the tree line, or when the trees shifted unnaturally, as though something too large to name had moved just out of view. The wind pushed her braid across her shoulder and stirred the old wind chimes near the window, a sound that echoed down the valley like a warning, or a welcome. She didn't know yet what kind of story was beginning, but she felt it like a pulse, a low thrum beneath the ground, beneath her ribs, beneath the frost that clung to the grass like a veil. Something had arrived, or maybe something had woken. The forest didn't say, it never did, but it remembered, and now it was listening. And Maeve, for the first time in 15 years, lit a lantern and left it by the door, not out of fear, out of respect, out of hope. She didn't sleep that night. Not really. Just watched the slope in the dark, her breath fogging the glass, waiting for the next footstep to fall where the world still remembered what it meant to keep a promise. The valley never needed much, just silence, and someone to hear it. The first snow didn't fall like a whisper. It crashed, thick wet flakes pelting the windshield like gravel, turning the steep curve of Douglas Pass into something meaner, slicker, crueler than it had been in a decade. The convoy should have waited. Hell, they'd been told to wait. But someone up the chain wanted the supplies in by sundown, and orders didn't care about mountains or weather. So the trucks kept climbing, engines growling under the strain, tires slipping against the grade, until the road disappeared beneath them like a lie coming undone. Lucas Danner had seen worse storms in Afghanistan. Worse roads, too. But back then he'd been younger, meaner himself, and filled with the kind of numb certainty only war could carve into a man's chest. Now he just braced his shoulder against the door, white-knuckling the grab bar as their cargo truck shuddered through another turn. The younger guys in the back were laughing nervously, making bad jokes about ghosts in the pass. Lucas didn't laugh. His jaw clenched. He stared through the blur of snow and thought of Michael. He didn't see the curve vanish until it was too late. The lead truck spun first. Just a sudden jerk sideways, tires floating, headlights swinging wide into nothing. The scream of twisting steel hit seconds before the explosion. Their own driver swore and cut the wheel, but the momentum pulled them sideways. The world tilted. Lucas's boots slammed the dash. The edge gave way. The whole front end dropped like a boulder through ice. Then darkness. He woke to cold. Blood. The taste of copper. His left leg pinned under twisted metal, smoke curling through the open cab. In the distance, nothing. Not the whine of engines, not voices, only wind. He clawed himself free, felt the skin tear on his palm. Didn't matter. He yanked open the side door and dropped into snow that swallowed him to the waist. Somewhere behind the truck, someone moaned. He turned, crawled. Found Corporal Reyes with a shattered arm, eyes wide, not blinking. A few feet away, Jensen coughed blood onto the white. 3 of them now, maybe the last 3. Lucas hauled them from the wreck. No radio, no flares. Just snow coming down like a punishment, and a mountain pass with no markers. They walked. For miles, maybe more. Snow blinding, air thin. Lucas didn't talk. Just kept moving forward, dragging Reyes when he had to, catching Jensen as he stumbled. His hands were shaking by the time he saw the chimney smoke. Thin, pale, like a breath held too long. They reached the tree line and saw it then. A wooden house hunched low beside a frozen creek, like something out of an old postcard from a world that no longer existed. The porch light flickered yellow. Maeve Hollis opened the door without asking who they were. She didn't flinch at the blood, didn't pause when Lucas collapsed against the wall, just nodded once, then moved with the practiced silence of someone who had seen more men bleed than most generals. She cleaned the wounds, splinted the arm, made a fire that actually stayed lit. And when Lucas tried to speak, his voice cracked dry, useless. So he said nothing, just watched her through the blur, her hands steady as they worked, her braid brushing her shoulder with each lean forward. By morning, the storm had swallowed the valley whole. They stayed. Word spread across Kaelen faster than snowmelt. The soldier boys from the pass, one with a head wound, one too quiet, one too angry. Maeve told them to rest, to recover, and in return, the townsfolk brought firewood, bread, old flannel blankets that smelled of cedar and dust. Lucas watched them all from the porch, still limping, still silent. He didn't trust easy. Jensen was the first to laugh again, playing cards with the old man who ran the mill. Reyes sat near the stove, staring into the flame like it held answers he couldn't ask. But Lucas kept to himself, sat by the window at night and stared into the woods, his leg propped up, his mind turning backward. Somalia, the ambush, his brother Michael screaming over the radio. Then silence. He carried that moment like a bullet never removed. When someone mentioned the Guardian, Lucas didn't look up. Bigfoot, the millman said, eyes squinting like he expected laughter. Only we don't call it that, too small a word. This one's older than the trees, protects the valley. Jensen chuckled, but the old man didn't smile. Sometimes you see it on fog nights, big as a barn door, quiet as a breath. If it don't want you to see it, you won't. That night Lucas stepped outside alone. The wind had died. The trees stood still, sharp against the dark like figures waiting in line. The snow crunched beneath his boot. He lit a cigarette with hands that still shook. Then something flickered, far off, deep in the forest. A light. Not a fire, not a flashlight. It blinked, faint, then gone. Lucas narrowed his eyes. The hair on the back of his neck rose. He didn't speak, just crushed the cigarette under his heel and turned back toward the cabin. The next morning, a boy named Eli tugged at his coat and pointed. "You want to see it?" Lucas blinked. "See what?" "The rock," Eli said, already moving. They hiked past the edge of the settlement, across a shallow ridge that opened to a clearing filled with ferns curled tight like fists. In the center stood a boulder, flat, weathered. Carved into its surface was a figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, 2 hands outstretched, palms bigger than any person's. Eli touched the stone reverently. "It's always been here. My granddad said it wasn't this clear before, said the hands change sometimes." Lucas crouched low. The lines were sharp, recent, but the moss hadn't been disturbed. He ran his fingers across the grooves, cold, deep. "Someone carved this?" Eli shrugged. "Or something." Lucas didn't laugh, didn't speak, just stood up slow, eyes still on the forest. Back at Maeve's, the porch light swayed in the breeze. The trees looked different now. Closer. He didn't sleep that night either. Sometime before dawn, he woke to a sound, wood creaking, as if weight had shifted somewhere nearby. He sat up, heart thudding slow and deep. Nothing moved outside, but the candle on the windowsill had gone out, and the snow beneath the porch steps was disturbed. One long impression like a footprint, too wide, too deep, spaced just far enough apart to mean something wasn't crawling. It had walked, past, or toward. He didn't wake the others. He just sat there with the loaded silence and watched the woods breathe. He didn't know yet that he had been chosen, that something ancient had already marked him, but he would. And when it came, he would not run, because somewhere in the hush of the pines, beyond the light, someone had finally looked back. It started with a silence that didn't feel like peace, the kind that settles too fast, like breath held underwater. It was just after dawn when Maeve Hollis stepped out and saw the Miller family standing in the snow, faces pale, the mother gripping her coat like it could hold back the truth. Their daughter, Taryn, hadn't come home last night. She was 8, bright, always barefoot, always chasing blue jays with her coat half-buttoned. She'd gone into the trees behind the orchard and never came back. No one said it at first, not out loud, but it was there, in the way people looked at the forest, not into it. The search started quick, boots stomping through new snow, dogs barking but not pulling forward, the sound of men's voices calling her name, growing sharper with every echo. Lucas Danner didn't ask to lead. He just did. His limp had faded some, but the ache still pulsed behind his knee. He moved with purpose, eyes scanning for signs the way his training had taught him. But in his chest, something different was growing. A cold he couldn't shake. Maeve walked beside him, wrapped in her heavy brown coat, her breath hanging in the air like smoke. Her steps were slower, more deliberate. She wasn't just searching with her eyes, she was listening for something else. The forest swallowed sound. They moved past the old trail markers, down through a thicket where the trees pressed closer. Lucas paused when he saw the prints. 2 sets, one smaller, light, barefoot. The other, he crouched. The second set was wide, deep, spaced too far apart to be human. He ran his gloved hand along the edges. The snow hadn't melted yet. These were fresh, within hours. Maeve said nothing. She just looked at the trees ahead like she already knew. They followed the trail through the pines. The branches above creaked with weight, the air turning thick, like the trees were holding something in. Then came the sound. Not a voice, not exactly. It echoed faintly, like a whisper stretched across the wind. A soft rising tone, almost melodic. Lucas stopped walking. His heart kicked once, hard. "Taryn," he called, but his voice sounded wrong, like it didn't belong here. The echo answered. Not a perfect match, close enough to freeze his spine. Maeve moved forward, eyes narrowed, mouth tight. They came to a clearing. The snow here was untouched, except for a trail that veered toward the edge, a slope of frozen earth that dropped into a ravine. Lucas stepped close, scanning the edge. That's when the ground gave out. His boots slipped, the world tilted. He tumbled forward, arms flailing, gravel and ice skimming past his coat. Then something caught him. Not rope, not luck. A hand, massive, covered in fine gray-brown fur. Fingers wrapped tight around his forearm. Strength without pain. He didn't scream. He didn't have time. He looked up, breath caught in his throat. Eyes met his. Amber, set deep in a face that wasn't beast, wasn't man. Something older, weathered. Then it was gone. The hand released him. Lucas rolled backward into the snow, gasping, his back against a pine. Maeve reached him seconds later, her face pale, eyes searching his. He didn't speak. Not yet. They followed the ridge west, looping back through a stand of frozen ferns. That's when they saw it. A shape ahead, small, hunched. Taryn. She sat in the crook of an old tree near a stream that hadn't fully frozen over, shivering but unharmed. Her eyes were wide, but not wild. In her lap, she clutched a deer antler, clean, pale, no moss. Maeve knelt first. Her voice was soft, not urgent. She didn't ask questions. Lucas stayed back, watching the girl's eyes flick to the trees behind them. He followed her gaze. Nothing moved, but the forest felt different now. Not hostile, protective. Later, as the sun set behind the pass, and the town gathered to wrap the girl in blankets and prayers, Lucas stood alone near the trail's edge. His thoughts were loud. He hadn't told anyone what he saw. Not yet. Not the hand. Not the eyes. Not the truth that sat heavy on his chest like frost refusing to melt. He touched his arm where the grip had been. The skin wasn't bruised, but he remembered the strength. And the restraint. That night Maeve brought him tea and didn't speak for a long time. Finally, she said, "Whatever's watching us, it isn't cruel." Lucas nodded slowly, but he didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, listening to the wind move through the trees like something breathing, and wondered what else might be out there, listening back. Not everything lost in the forest is meant to be found. But sometimes something ancient finds you first, and chooses not to let you fall. The antler felt heavier now, not in weight, but in meaning. Lucas carried it tucked inside the canvas of his pack like a question he couldn't shake loose. For 3 nights, he'd turned it over in his hands, brushing the smooth edge with his thumb, tracing the curves where the moss had once clung. Since that night in the woods, since the hand, no, since the choice, not to let him fall, something inside him had shifted. He didn't talk about it. Not to Maeve, not to Reyes or Jensen, but he started walking longer every morning, further into the trees, not to search anymore, but to understand. He felt it behind him in the stillness, like the silence was watching and waiting. On the 4th morning after the rescue, the sun barely peeled through the clouds when Lucas packed up early and didn't tell anyone where he was going. He left behind the warm tin of Maeve's tea, left behind the frost-covered porch steps, and took only 2 things, the antler and an old brass Zippo. The lighter had been his brother's. "For Michael" was etched shallow into the side, faded by time and sweat and war. Lucas didn't light it much anymore, but today it burned in his pocket like a pulse. He followed no trail, just the pull. The wind had dropped, but the woods still whispered. He moved past the old black oak by the creek, past the stone outcrop the kids called the Crow's Jaw, and deeper into where the trees grew wider, the trunks moss-covered and leaning like watchers. The air got colder, not from elevation, but something else. Older than season, older than cold. A breath held too long. He found the spot around midday, where the earth sloped into a hidden basin. A line of boulders rimmed the edge like broken teeth. In the center, a slab of stone stretched flat between 2 cedar trunks, like an altar carved by time. The snow there was shallow, blown off by the wind that circled unnaturally still. The whole clearing felt like it had been waiting for him. He stepped forward, unshouldered his pack, and set the antler gently in the center of the stone. Then, without a word, he pulled the lighter from his pocket and laid it beside it. Metal on stone, bone beside fire. He didn't speak. There was no need. The offering said everything. The wind picked up just enough to sway the trees. The silence deepened, like the forest was holding breath. Lucas stood back, hands loose at his sides. He could feel something nearby, not close enough to see, but not far either. Just beyond the line of trees, just behind the sound of snow falling. His chest tightened, not from fear, but the ache of memory and meaning colliding. Something stirred behind the stone. He turned slowly. It stepped out not with threat, but with gravity, as if the ground made space for it. 7, maybe 8 feet tall, its frame wide but not monstrous, covered in thick fur that shimmered dark brown streaked with silver, catching bits of light like the surface of a river under moonlight. The face stopped him cold. Not animal, not human, but something suspended between the two. The brow was low, the jaw strong, but the eyes, those eyes were what undid him. Deep set, dark amber, and ancient. Eyes that had seen more than any man. Eyes that had watched men ruin and redeem themselves for generations. Eyes that, in that moment, were not afraid of him. It moved slowly, deliberate. Each step pressed into the snow without sound. It didn't grunt, didn't snarl. It paused before the stone and looked down at the offering. Then, with a hand that dwarfed the antler, it picked up the lighter. Lucas held still, his breath barely breaking the air. The creature turned the Zippo over in its palm, the metal reflecting soft winter light. It studied the etched letters. There was something in the way it tilted its head, like recognition, or perhaps respect. Then, slowly, it set the lighter back down. The antler it kept. They stood in silence. No movement, no spoken pact, but something passed between them. Not a word, not even a nod. Just presence, a shared knowing, the kind of thing that couldn't be taught or explained. A thread pulled taut between grief and grace. Then the creature turned, melted back into the woods as quietly as it had come. Lucas stayed there long after it disappeared, the lighter sitting cold on the stone. He reached out, took it back into his hand, and closed his fingers around it. When he turned to leave, something caught his eye on the rock wall behind the cedar trunks. He stepped closer, brushed aside a drift of snow, and froze. Handprints, dozens, maybe hundreds, some small, human. Others wider, fingers longer, spaced differently, all carved into the stone like layers of memory. Some fresh, some worn nearly smooth by time. They overlapped, climbed the stone like generations leaving marks on shared ground. He stared, heart thudding. At the center, near the bottom, 2 hands met, one human, one not. Their fingers almost touching like a memory frozen mid-motion. He reached out, touched the place where the fingers nearly met. The rock was cold, but not dead. The wind shifted behind him. A low breeze that stirred the leaves without snapping branches, that breathed past his ears like a whisper he couldn't understand, but somehow still heard. That night, back in the valley, Maeve was tending to the fire when Lucas returned. His face was pale, his eyes hollowed like someone who'd seen too much and not enough. He sat down slow, placed the lighter gently beside him, and didn't say a word. Maeve didn't ask. Instead, she poured 2 cups of tea, handed him one, and looked toward the window. "You gave it something," she said softly. He nodded. "You get something back?" He thought for a moment, then whispered, "I think I did." Outside, the trees creaked softly. The porch light buzzed once, then steadied. No one else in the valley knew what had happened. But that night, the wind blew different through Kaelen. A little warmer, a little more alive. The kind of wind that carried not warning, but promise. And somewhere in the basin beyond the ridge, a sacred object had changed hands. Not stolen, not lost, given. The pact had begun, and whatever had watched this land long before any road was carved through it, now remembered his name. It started with wind, but not the kind that sang through pine needles or danced against window panes. This wind came warm from the south, dragging the scent of thaw and rot, like the forest exhaling after holding breath too long. The ice cracked in the creek at dawn. Snowmelt whispered through the moss. Birds returned, not in flocks, but as shy loners calling to no one. Change had come to Kaelen Valley, but not the gentle kind. That night, just after sundown, the sound came. A low groan deep in the belly of the forest, followed by a single thunderclap that didn't belong to any storm. Maeve heard it first from her porch, tea forgotten in her lap. Then came the roar, not from sky, but from earth. Water, rushing, breaking. The beaver dam had given way. By the time Maeve reached the road, others had already gathered in boots and coats, lanterns swinging in frantic hands. The path that followed the creek was gone, swallowed in a roar of black water and broken branches. The current tore through the center of the valley, ripping up fence posts, dragging straw bales and a chicken coop that vanished like it had never existed. No one knew what caused it. Some muttered about the old dam being too weak. Others shook their heads. Then Clive Rutledge arrived in his green truck, teeth clenched behind the wheel. The man stepped out with his boots already wet and his voice already raised. "It was the creature," he said. "The thing you all keep pretending doesn't exist." The crowd turned, whispers, faces shadowed by lantern light. "I saw it," he said, louder now. "Something big, real big, broke the dam with its bare hands and ran off like a ghost." Maeve's jaw tightened. Lucas stepped out from behind her, mud still on his boots from scouting the upstream bend. "You didn't see anything," he said flatly. Clive pointed a shaking finger at him. "You and your mountain stories brought this here." But before any reply could be spoken, a scream cut through the trees. A woman's voice, sharp, terrified. Everyone turned. The light shifted. Downstream, barely visible in the moonlight, something moved, large, upright, striding through the waist-deep water. People scattered, stumbling back from the banks, some dropping lanterns in the mud. It was tall, easily over 8 feet, broad shoulders glistening wet beneath the moon. And on its shoulder, clinging, trembling, was a child, Taryn. The creature moved with purpose, not speed. It cradled her like something fragile, crossing the current as if it weren't fighting it at all. Its fur dripped black with river water. Its steps were silent. The crowd froze. No one moved. No one breathed. Lucas stepped forward, chest rising and falling in time with the current. Maeve's hand caught his arm, but gently. The creature reached the wooden footbridge, now partly submerged. It knelt, carefully, set Taryn down on the planks. Her lips were blue, but her eyes were open. She didn't cry. She just looked up at it like she already knew it. Then the creature stood, slowly. It looked at them, not angry, not afraid, but something older, sadder. Then it turned and melted back into the trees, the water parting around it. The silence broke like glass. Clive lifted his rifle. "No!" Maeve shouted. The shot rang out anyway. It echoed through the trees, loud and violent and desperate. Birds fled from the pines. The wind sucked back into the valley like lungs recoiling from a burn. But the creature didn't scream. It vanished. Lucas shoved the rifle down. "You fool!" "It attacked her," Clive snapped. "She's not hurt," Maeve said, already pulling Taryn into her arms. "She was in the river. She was saved from it," Lucas barked. The argument died as quickly as it started, because something had shifted. The water was still rising, but more slowly now. The chaos had passed. What remained was mud and breath, and questions too large to name. By dawn, the current had slowed to a crawl. The village was left coated in silt and broken things. The footbridge sagged. The fields gleamed with standing water. But the people were alive. Lucas walked the river's edge. His eyes caught something pale stuck in the roots of a fallen tree. He crouched and pulled it free. A stick, thick, broken at one end. the other end blackened with scoring, drill marks, industrial. A blasting cap still wired into the center. He looked up slowly. The break in the dam had been no accident. Later that morning, as the townsfolk gathered to count chickens and salvage tools, Lucas handed Maeve the stick of dynamite. She turned it in her hands. Her face tightened, but she said nothing. Only looked toward the road where Clive's truck had driven off an hour earlier without saying goodbye. Maeve and Lucas followed the receding water back upstream, where the flow had carved a new scar into the riverbed. Along the banks, where the mud was soft and wide, she saw it, a trail of prints. One small, barefoot, one large, bleeding. They followed the prints through the brush, across a shallow ravine, and to the edge of the lowland where the trees thickened into a curtain of limbs. There, lodged between two stones at the creek's mouth, lay a long branch, too large for a man to carry, propped against the current, blocking the way back upstream, like a barricade. "He's hiding," Maeve whispered. Lucas said nothing. He stared at the stone beneath the water, where a small streak of dark red swirled like ink. "Bleeding," he said quietly. Maeve nodded. "He saved her." "He saved all of us," she said. Lucas crouched by the stone. His hand hovered over the water, then settled on the edge. Cold, still moving. "Now he's hurt," Maeve said. "And he's alone." Lucas looked up at the trees, at the space between the branches where the sky broke through like a wound. Maeve stepped beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "We're the ones who sinned," she said. "He's the one who paid." The valley held its breath again, but this time it didn't feel ominous. It felt like a choice waiting to be made. And deep beneath the surface, in the old bones of the land, something sacred was retreating. Not out of fear, out of grief, out of mercy. Because sometimes, what we call monsters are the only ones left who remember what it means to protect something that can't protect itself. The water continued to flow, but softer now, slower, as if it too was mourning. Lucas rose, his boots sinking into the mud. He looked back once more toward the barricade where the blood had stopped dripping. Then he turned and walked toward the mountain. Not to chase, to find. And behind them, the antler drifted downstream, caught in the roots, swaying gently like a promise half buried in water. The snow didn't vanish. It receded, quietly, like an old truth returning to the dirt. By early April, most of the valley had shed its winter skin, leaving behind wet pine needles, the smell of thaw, and the sound of things waking up too soon. The wind had softened, but not the silence. That remained heavy. Heavier now that everyone knew something had bled in the woods to keep a child alive, and vanished into it afterward like smoke drawn back into a flame. The barricade of logs by the creek still held, moss beginning to creep across the bark like it had always been there. Lucas stood over it each morning without speaking. Then one day, without warning, he just stepped over it and kept going. Maeve didn't ask to follow. She simply packed nettle bandages, ground root balm, and a flask of willow bark tea, and met him at the edge of the trees before sunrise. He didn't argue. He didn't speak. He just nodded once and let the woods take them both in. They walked for most of the day, cutting through high ridgelines and crumbled rock where the pines grew too thin and the air too still. Lucas followed the blood, not fresh anymore, but there in the places the light didn't reach. Small smears on stone, the shape of a palm pressed to soil, the bend of tall grasses where no deer would rest. Whatever had crawled away from that river had done so slowly, not hiding, retreating. By afternoon, they reached the limestone cliffs above the western basin, where the rock wall curved inward and the snow melt roared in sheets down the moss-dark stone. Behind the falls, hidden just enough to vanish from any map, the entrance waited, wide enough for a bear, tall enough for a man to walk upright. Maeve stood still for a moment. Lucas watched her. Her lips moved once, silently, like a prayer meant only for the earth. Then they stepped inside. The air changed instantly. Not cold, not warm, just damp and ancient. The kind of stillness that came from being untouched for longer than memory. The floor sloped downward, narrow at first, then opened like a hollow lung, a sanctuary beneath stone. The ceiling rose into a dome of layered rock, slick with condensation. Water dripped slowly down the walls, echoing with each fall. But what caught Maeve's breath wasn't the sound. It was the carvings. They covered the walls in uneven spirals, reaching high into the stone like vines climbing toward forgotten light. Some figures were human, clearly. Men and women etched with raised arms, holding torches, kneeling in circles. Others were less so. Towering shapes with long arms, hands larger than any man's, depicted beside waterfalls and trees and stones arranged in circles. Always together, always sharing space. At the center of the wall, a single carving stood apart. A fire. Hands on both sides of it, one human, one not. Lucas stepped closer, his breath caught. Below the fire, two objects had been carved into the rock. A curved antler and something flame-shaped, like a symbol for light. He didn't say a word. He just reached out and placed his palm over the human hand in the stone. The shape matched. Almost. Maeve walked further into the chamber. That's when she saw him. He lay curled beside a pool where the rock dipped low and caught the falling water in a clear basin. He wasn't asleep. His eyes were half open. Breathing. Barely. Blood darkened the fur at his side. The wound had scabbed but not healed. Flies circled near the edges, but none touched him. His arm was cradled under his chest. His back rose slowly with each breath. But his eyes, those amber eyes, watched them without fear. Maeve knelt first. Lucas stayed near the entrance, his pulse high in his throat. She moved slowly, setting her bag down. Her fingers trembled as she opened the satchel of herbs, but not from fear, from awe. Her voice was soft as she whispered to the air, as if to ask the cave itself for permission. When she placed the salve near his side, the creature didn't flinch. She soaked a rag in cool water from the basin and touched it to the matted fur. It was warm. Too warm. Fever. Lucas stepped closer. The creature looked at him now. Something passed between them. Not challenge, not plea. Just a gaze like someone remembering you from another life. Lucas knelt, cupped water in both hands, and held it out. The creature didn't move at first. Then its head lowered slowly. One massive hand reached forward, not to take the water, but to cover Lucas's. Gently, like a father might steady a child's hands. It drank. The silence in the cave deepened, but it wasn't empty. It was full of things words couldn't hold. Maeve worked in quiet rhythm. She packed herbs around the wound, whispered thanks between each gesture. Lucas stayed beside the basin, refilling water, watching the creature's eyes fade slowly from strain into sleep. Not full sleep, but rest. Trust. Hours passed. The light from the entrance dimmed. Shadows stretched across the carvings like moving stories. Maeve sat beside the wall, her eyes on the figure with the fire. He never meant to be seen, she said softly. But he chose to be. Lucas didn't answer. He was watching the water now, following the stream that curled through the back of the cave. A fissure in the stone, narrow but steady, where the spring fed into the basin and slipped out through cracks toward the west. He followed it with his eyes until something clicked into place. "Maeve," he said. She turned. He pointed to the current. "This flows west." She frowned, then stood slowly and followed him to the crack. She placed her fingers in the current, felt its cold rush against her skin. Her face shifted. "That's the line Clive marked." Lucas nodded. "He wants to drill here," she whispered. He didn't reply. He didn't have to. Maeve looked back toward the creature, still breathing shallowly beside the water. "He's guarding it." Lucas stepped back toward the wall, looked at the carvings again. The trees, the spring. the fire, the hands. He's always been guarding it. They stood in silence. Outside the cave, wind moved through the cliffs, soft but rising. Maeve looked toward the entrance. They'll come. Lucas stepped beside her. Then we'll be ready. Neither spoke after that. They stayed with him through the night, watched over the basin like sentinels. And when the first light broke through the crack in the stone, catching the water in silver lines across the chamber, the creature stirred. His eyes opened. He looked at them, not as strangers, but as something remembered. And in that silence, they understood. The mountain wasn't his refuge. It was his responsibility. And now, it had become theirs too. Summer came hard that year. No rain, no clouds, just heat like a fever pressing down on Kaelen Valley. The wind lost its cool edge, and the trees no longer whispered. They stood rigid and silent, like they too were holding something in. Fields cracked, wells lowered. The creek behind Maeve's house ran thinner by the day, curling around the stones like a thread unraveling. People grew quiet, tempers grew short, and somewhere behind the mountain, machines started moving. Clive Rutledge didn't sneak. He never had. When he wanted something, he walked straight into the middle of town and told folks why they needed it too. This time, it was jobs, money, easier winters, a future. His voice rose loud above the picnic tables by the church. His sleeves rolled back, sweat slick across his jaw. Behind him, a map, folded, stamped with red lines across the ridge west of the basin, the place Maeve had begged them to leave alone. You think he's protecting water, Clive said. I think he's sitting on gold. The room didn't cheer, not exactly. But no one stopped him. Lucas watched from the back, arms crossed, eyes like stone. He'd tried to warn them. The carvings, the stream, the sanctuary. But folks didn't want stories anymore. They wanted promises. And Clive gave them just enough to believe he might be right. By Thursday, the trucks rolled in. 6 men in hard hats and goggles unloaded cables and metal cases marked with flammable warnings. The smell of diesel followed them like a ghost. By nightfall, a small shack had been built at the edge of the western slope, and generators kicked on, loud enough to drown out the creek. Lucas paced the porch while Maeve packed. She moved with purpose, her braid tied tight, her hands calmer than they should have been. We don't have time to convince them, she said. We've tried. They won't stop. They don't believe it's sacred, he muttered. Maeve looked up at him. Her voice didn't rise. Then we have to make sure it survives them. They left just after midnight. No lanterns, no fire. The trail to the sanctuary was darker now. Clouds thick above, no moon to guide them. But Lucas knew the way by heart. Every bend, every route, every slope where the wind changed. When they reached the waterfall, he paused. The spray touched his face like a warning. Then they passed through. The creature wasn't in the same place. He was standing now, barely, his back pressed against the stone, his breath shallow but steady. When Lucas entered, the creature looked up, not startled, not weak. Ready? Maeve stepped forward first, her voice low, steady. They're coming for the water. No reaction, she continued. They'll drill past the outer slope. They think there's something valuable underneath. Still silence. Then Lucas spoke. We'll stop them, but if we fail... The creature blinked once. Lucas stepped closer. We need your help. The cave was so quiet, the drip from the basin echoed like a bell. Then the creature moved. It wasn't fast, but it was deliberate. Each step forward grounded in something deeper than instinct. He passed them without touching, his body casting a shadow across the carvings like the past was moving again. At the mouth of the cave, he paused, looked at the water, then at the sky. He knew. They left together before dawn. Maeve, Lucas, and the guardian of Kaelen. Clive's crew hadn't waited. The first bore was already in the ground, vibrating through rock and root like a fist pounding the belly of the mountain. Lucas spotted the stacks of explosives beside the shaft. enough to blow through a quarter-mile of earth. He stepped out into the clearing first, Maeve behind him. The workers didn't notice her. They were too busy yelling at the man in the flannel who just walked in like he owned the mountain. Clive turned when he saw him. "You got something to say, Sergeant?" Lucas didn't raise his voice. "You have to stop," Clive laughed. "Still chasing ghosts?" "It's not just a ghost," Maeve said quietly. "It's a guardian." Clive stepped forward. "You don't get to decide what's worth protecting." "I'm not deciding," Lucas replied. "I'm warning. Step aside." "You don't understand," Maeve said. "This mountain's alive. That spring feeds more than your greed." Clive pulled his walkie. "You've got 2 minutes to clear the blast zone." Lucas's voice cracked across the field. "You set off that charge. It won't be just the mountain that breaks." The machines hummed louder. The crew backed away, toward the safety line. Then came the growl. It didn't rise all at once. It started low, like stone shifting. Then it climbed into something guttural. Wounded, final. Trees quaked. Birds exploded from the canopy. Then it stepped out. The men dropped their gear. The creature stood at the edge of the tree line, taller than the rig behind it. Its chest rose like a bellows. Its fur caught the rising light in streaks of silver. But its eyes, those human, haunted eyes, never blinked. Clive stepped back. It moved forward. Not charging, walking. Each step cracked the dry earth. Lucas stayed still. Maeve didn't breathe. When the creature reached the first cable, it stopped. Looked down at the wires. Then at the drill. Then at the dynamite. The wind died. Then it ran. Not from them. Into the site. It lunged toward the supports and drove its shoulder into the main column. The metal shrieked. Sparks flew. The drill cracked sideways. Dust exploded from the shaft. "Shut it down!" someone screamed. But it was too late. The structure collapsed inward. Clive turned and grabbed the walkie. "Blow it!" "No!" Lucas roared. But the click had already happened. The explosion didn't roar upward. It roared sideways, into the mountain. The blast caught the hollow under the ridge, and the ground buckled. Trees split. A roar, deeper than any voice, ripped through the basin. Lucas saw it all in pieces, the creature slamming its body into the falling beam, the cave entrance beginning to collapse. Maeve screaming his name, then darkness. He woke with blood in his mouth. The world was smoke. He pulled himself out from the edge of the rubble, hands raw, lungs burning. Maeve was beside him. Alive, but the cave was gone, buried. No sound inside, no movement. Lucas stumbled forward, shouting. But only dust answered. Then, from beneath the stone, a shift, a movement. A single massive hand reached up, bloodied, trembling, and pushed him away. Pushed him out, then vanished. The rocks came down. Silence followed. The sky cracked above them. Then the rain came, first in drops, then in sheets. And from the center of the rubble, water spilled, not fast, not wild, but steady, cold and clean. It filled the cracks, fed the creek, reached the fields below. By the time the townsfolk arrived, the storm had broken, and from the hillside, they saw it. A stream flowing where none had been. Kaelen Creek reborn. Maeve sat beside the debris, fingers in the water. Lucas didn't speak. There was nothing to say, because sometimes the ones who guard us don't ask for thanks. They just stay behind and make sure the promise holds. Autumn returned like it always did, with gold in its hands and silence in its breath. The leaves along the valley curled at the edges, painted in fire and rust, then let go without sound. Kaelen Creek, once a timid trickle, now ran full and clear, humming over smooth stone like a song remembered. Trees grew taller that year, maybe not by much, but enough for the children to notice. The orchard bore fruit early, apples heavy, peaches sweeter. Folks said it was the rain, or the soil, or just good fortune. No one mentioned the cave. Not anymore. Maeve Hollis moved slower now. Her legs ached when the wind turned cold, and her hands shook when she held a pen too long. But she still woke before the sun, still boiled her herbs, still left the back door open just enough for the morning air to wander in. Her porch had a new coat of paint, green, chipped already, and the rocking chair faced the creek, not the mountain. That view belonged to memory. She kept a notebook now, not the leather-bound journal from years past. This one was smaller, lined, the kind you could find at any grocery store. But the pages inside held something weightier than paper. She titled it in pencil, barely legible. Field Notes of a Promise. She never let anyone read it, not even Lucas. Sometimes she wrote a few lines and stared at them like she was seeing them from far away. Other times she just sat, pen resting on the paper, listening to the trees shift behind the house like they were trying to speak through the bark. The final pages came slowly, not because she didn't know what to say, but because some truths take longer to say goodbye to. On one of the last pages, she wrote, "Not all who remain silent are monsters. Some of them are protectors. Some of them have always been." She set her pen down after that. Lucas didn't live in the valley anymore. After the blast, after the summer dried out and then softened again, he left quietly, without a speech or a farewell. Just a note tucked into Maeve's tea jar. Said he'd be near, if ever needed. Said some debts can't be repaid, only carried forward. The town talked less now. Fewer legends passed over fences. The children still played near the creek, still chased frogs and tossed pebbles into the water, but even they lowered their voices near the ridge. They called the spring the Silent Well. No one touched the trees around it. But stories, real stories, have a way of stitching themselves into the bones of a place, and the elders whispered now and then, not of a monster, but of a figure, one that walked through the trees without breaking a twig, one that watched over them not out of obligation but memory. No one had seen him, not for years, but footprints had returned once, at the edge of a fresh snowfall, large, wide-spaced, leading toward the mountain and disappearing beneath a cedar tree that hadn't grown there before. Maeve saw them from her window. She didn't tell anyone. Instead, she lit a candle, poured herself a cup of spruce tea, and opened the letter that had arrived that morning. Lucas had written from a small town in Montana. Said the water there ran thin. Said the folks were kind, but something was missing in the dirt. He didn't sign it with his name, just with one line. "If the water ever stops, check the stones." She smiled, folded the letter, placed it in the notebook, then closed it for the last time. That night the wind changed. It came down through the pass in long waves, touching the window panes like a song hummed through the ribs of the mountain. Maeve sat by the fire, blanket around her knees, her eyes drifting toward the shadows outside. She thought she heard footsteps once, heavy, measured. She didn't rise. Didn't need to. Somewhere in the dark, something paused beneath the trees. Not lurking, listening. She whispered aloud, soft as breath. Maybe not all protectors wear human skin. Then the wind passed. The trees settled. The fire cracked once, and the room filled with warmth again. At dawn, the light came through the kitchen window the way it always had. Gentle, golden, just enough to stir the dust. And by the creek, half buried in the moss, lay a new branch, clean, pale, not from any tree nearby. She didn't pick it up, just looked at it, and smiled. A season passed, then another. Children grew taller. Stories faded, then circled back again. No one spoke of the explosion anymore, or the creature, or the cave. But the water never stopped, and on certain nights, when the valley grew too quiet, and the trees bent just so in the wind, someone always left the porch light on, just in case the guardian ever came home. Not for thanks, but for memory. And in that memory, carved deep into the rock beneath the ridge, was a promise. One made long before the town, or the road, or the blast. A promise of mercy. A promise kept in silence. A promise that lived still, not in names or monuments, but in the water and the earth, and the way the night never truly felt empty. The valley remembered, and so did the one watching. Some stories are not meant to be shouted. They're meant to be carried, like quiet lanterns through the dark. They linger in the hush between seasons, in the way wind folds around trees, or how water carves stone without asking for credit. Stories like these aren't built on victories or loud heroics. They're shaped by sacrifice, by quiet acts of courage that go unseen, by the sacred weight of promises kept long after the world forgets they were ever made. There are places on this earth where time moves differently, places that don't need to be conquered or explained, just understood. And if we listen closely, we find that the land remembers more than we do. It remembers who took with respect and who gave without asking. It remembers the footsteps of those who walked gently. It remembers kindness, and maybe that's what this story has always been about. Not monsters or myths, but the simple truth that compassion leaves a trace, that mercy echoes louder than fear, that sometimes the strongest protectors are the ones who ask for nothing in return. They don't speak in our language. They don't need to. Their silence is their promise. Their presence is their gift. In a world that often rushes to label what it doesn't understand, there's still power in pausing, in choosing empathy over control, in believing that some things, some beings, deserve to be left wild, not because they are dangerous, but because they are sacred. Because not everything is meant to be owned. Some things are meant to be honored. If this story reached you, stirred something in your chest, or made you feel a little less alone in the stillness, we're grateful you stayed with us through the last page. This isn't just the end of a tale. It's a reminder that even in the quietest corners of the world, love endures, trust endures, and the unseen work of guardianship is never done. Thank you for listening, for feeling, for being part of this journey. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What moved you? What stayed with you? What questions you're still holding? Leave us a comment below. And if these stories speak to your heart, consider following or subscribing so we can keep exploring them together. Until next time, listen closely. Some promises still live in the water.